everybody. Recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 141 of the Movement Debrief. And today, folks, we're going to be hanging out, drinking in the back of an El Camino because we're going to talk about pelvic gait mechanics. Yes, folks, you got some questions for me about gait, and you're wondering, how do I understand the whole walking thing? Is that relevant when it comes to assessing, moving, and grooving, and everything else you need to be walking like a fiend? These will be answered today because your boy, Big Z, has got a bunch of questions that have been asked by the people. They will be answered for the people by this people right here. Fam recognize fam. Without further ado, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Andy. Here's what Andy asks. Could you explain the lumbopelvic mechanics, in particular, the SI joint mechanics during the gait cycle? Andy, yes, I can. If you really want to dive into the weeds of gait mechanics, the best book out there is Human Locomotion by Mashad. I'll link it in the show notes, which will be found on zachcouples.com/pelvic-gait-mechanics. I strongly encourage you to get that book because I'm drawing a lot of my gait mechanics from that. It's very well done. And I also, another great resource if you really want to dive into this would be also Daddy-O Pops Bill Hartman, because I think he has taken the whole gait mechanics and simplified it even further. So check those two out. This would be my interpretation of those two sources, and it will tie into how I'm approaching movement for the next question. We're going to use your left leg as a reference point. And the reason why that is, stay tuned, because it's going to make a lot more sense once we get into treatment. So if I am going to discuss gait, I'm going to break it up into three phases. The first would be initial contact, when your foot hits the ground. They say everything changes when that happens, you know. Initial contact, mid-stance, which would be when your center of mass is over the leg and you're kind of, in the middle. The last part would be late stance, or the propulsive phase of gait. So you have contact, mid-stance, and propulsion. Those are the three phases of gait when we're talking about the stance phase. And that's what I'm going to use in reference to describing what's going on at this lovely pelvis that I have, which would be my grandson. Whatever is occurring on the stance leg, the opposite will be occurring on the swing leg. So if I'm ERing at any point in time on my stance leg, I'm likely going to be IRing at my swing leg. General rules of thumb. With that in mind, let's walk through this. Thank you. I'll be here all night, which is not far off because I got a lot of work to do. Anyways, at stance, when your foot touches the ground, your sacrum is going to be rotated or oriented more so to the right. And then I'm going to be moving towards the opposite end of the spectrum as I go through the phases of gait. So with contact, rule of thumb, sacrum is oriented right, but is going to begin rotating to the left. So that's phase one. You got a little bit more ER happening on the left. You have a little bit more IR happening on the right, with the sacrum oriented right, beginning to rotate to the left. That's step one. When I go into mid-stance, the hip is flexed in this position. I'm going to be moving towards more hip extension. As I hit mid-stance, the sacrum and the pelvis begin to adduct towards the midline of the left leg. So I have this side shift, or this oblique shift at my pelvis, with the left innominate being higher than the right. This is an adduction component, and this is a further progression of the sacrum rotating to the left. It rotates to the left and then it glides downward. When I'm in this situation where the sacrum is kind of side shifted to the right almost, with the left sacrum up higher than the right, you're going to have more adduction and internal rotation happening at the pelvis and the FA joint for that matter. That's mid-stance. So it's normal to have a frontal plane side shift during this portion of mid-stance with continual rotating happening of the sacrum to the left. Early stance, more flexion, ER happening. Sacrum is oriented right, but it's beginning to rotate to the left. When I hit mid-stance, I have more hip extension, adduction, and internal rotation on my left leg. I have this frontal plane shift happening where the left innominate is higher than the right, dynamite. And then the opposite, of course, is happening on the right leg. So I have more abduction and ER. Late stance, propulsion, toe off, whatever you want to call it. Now the sacrum is fully rotated to the left. So I have more counter nutation on the left side. I have a little bit of nutation going on the right side. But the sacrum is rotating left. At this point in time, you're going to have more femoral external rotation on the right. You're going to have maximal extension and internal rotation on the left. And that would be the 3 phases of gait when it comes to stance. So you have a starting point, early stance. Sacrum is oriented right, beginning to rotate left. It's more of an ER bias on the left side. When I hit mid-stance, I'm still rotating the sacrum to the left, but I have more adduction and internal rotation happening at the pelvis and the femur. And then, with propulsive phase of gait, late stance, the sacrum is fully rotated to the left. I have a lot more adduction and internal rotation, but at the pelvis, there's more of an ER bias. And this is where I think Bill's model is very useful and effective, because then it applies, especially when we're talking to interventions, is you have more of an ER bias at early stance, a more IR bias of the pelvis at mid stance, and a re-external rotation bias at late stance or propulsion. And we have this alternation between these phases as you go, with the sacrum essentially spinning around the stance leg as I move through my phases of gait. And that's really what happens every time you take a step. And then when I go to the right, it simply alternates. I rotate around the left leg, and then I rotate the sacrum around the right leg. And we just do this. To summarize that right quick for you fine folks. Sacrum orients right when I'm talking about left stance, or it orients away, and it's beginning to rotate towards the stance leg. At initial contact, there is more external rotation happening. The sacrum is going to begin rotating to the left. As it rotates to the left, it's going to have some counter nutation on the left, a little bit of nutation on the right. That's what creates that sacral rotation left. As I hit mid-stance, I have almost a frontal plane side shift downward, where the left innominate would be higher than the right. This is more internal rotation biased. At the femur on the left, you have adduction and IR and extension happening. And then as I hit propulsive phase or late stance, the sacrum fully rotates to the left. You have more general external rotation happening about the pelvis, and on the stance leg you have progressive extension, adduction, internal rotation happening. Whatever is happening on the stance leg, the opposite happens on the swing. So if it's at initial contact, flexion, abduction, ER, the swing leg is going to be more extended, adducted, and IR'd. As I hit mid-stance, more extension, adduction, IR on the stance leg. Swing leg is more flexion, adduction, ER, and then that progresses to the full amount when I hit late stance or the propulsive phase of gait. Amazing question, Andy. Hopefully that helped you. The last question, because this one's going to get a little bit in the weeds, comes from Ancour. Hopefully I pronounced your name well, Ankur. Here's what they ask. How do you conclude which stance of gait each pelvis is stuck in after you assess your clients? AKA, how do you treat these things? The first thing I want to say is we're never stuck in any one position. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I get this a lot is people think of asymmetries, you know, I feel like I'm rotated more to the right and I can't rotate to the left, or my left innominate's a bit more prominent than the others. So I just want to be very clear that it's not uncommon and it's very normal to have asymmetries side to side. If you feel that you have a femur that's internally rotated and your tibia is externally rotated, some of that to some degree is probably normal, and it doesn't mean you're stuck in a particular phase of gait and, you know, you're only early stancing it and you never hit late stance. You're still walking, right? So just public service announcement in that regard. There's a friend of mine, name's Veronica. She's really smart. I'll link her in the show notes. She had this cool saying where if you took a microscope and you looked at it underneath your food, you would see a ton of microbes you probably would never eat. So we don't do that, but we still eat, right? Same thing with movement. We get into the nitty gritty, but it doesn't mean that you're broken because you exhibit these particular things. Anyways, how do we conclude what, instead of what you're stuck in, what areas you need to work on? Public service announcement before you get into looking at what phase of gait I need to focus on. Ask yourself this: am I really stacking? And if the answer is no, which it more often than not is, forget about this. Pause the video, come back to it, go to the stack video that I'll link in the show notes for you, and get really freaking good at that. Because if you don't have that, the stuff I'm going to be talking about with this pelvis is a moot point. So please stack first. And this is going to be extra important when we're talking about what assessment findings would implicate me working on either early stance, mid stance, or late stance. Because when I would work on one of these particular gait phases, the time that I go after that is if there is a clear and distinct asymmetry present in movement after I've stacked my supreme clientele like a boss. Many times when you're doing your assessment, you're going to say, well, you know, this person has 100 degrees of hip flexion on the left and they got 107 on the right. Clearly that's an asymmetry and we need to work on an asymmetrical thing. False. Well, it is an asymmetry. That person is still restricted bilaterally. Many times when you have a bilateral restriction, you need to work on simpler components first and make that a clear and distinct asymmetry. Many times if you stack someone and you go through some of the progressions that I've gotten on my website, that person may go from a 145 degree hip flexion on the left and they could be like a 125 on the right. You didn't have to get too fancy. Master the basics first. It is in that latter scenario that I talked about, someone has full hip flexion on one side, limited on the other, that the phases of gait become much more important. I want you to think about this. Remember the heuristic that we discussed when we were talking about how gait works. If I'm doing one motion on one side, I'm going to be doing the exact opposite motion on the other side. So in early stance, and we'll use the left as our reference point. The reason why we're going to use left as our reference point is because more often than not, we're going to be working on left stance when we're talking about restoring phases of gait. And the reason why that is because as human beings, we do have a right-sided bias. This is pretty clear in some of the research that was done in the Spine Journal from 06 to 07. There's an ad nauseum amount of people who talk about asymmetries within the body, ranging from PRI to the Dunnington stress pattern to the common compensatory pattern by Singh, ad nauseum. So it's there, it's a thing. We want to respect that. The right-sided bias is there. We're going to be going more to the left than Beyonce did on one of her earlier albums. Now, let's say someone needs to work on early stance phase of gait. Remember, folks, the sacrum needs to begin rotating left, but the femurs, and this is the key that lets you know what phase you got to work on. If the left femur is in a flexed, abducted, and externally rotated position, guess what they're going to be limited in? They're going to be limited in extension, adduction, and internal rotation. If you have restrictions in those motions, chances are you might not need to work on early stance mechanics. What that means is you would choose activities where the left leg is in front, the right leg is in back, and you begin rotating the pelvis to the left. A great move that I have for this would be a bottoms up shifty split squat where the left leg's in front and you're pointing the zipper to the left, you come up, proceed to hate life. It is brutal. So brutal, but so glorious in many ways. Try that, because if you got someone with those particular limitations, or on the right side, they'll have a limitation in flexion, abduction, ER based measures. You see that presentation and they've stacked, that's a good time to start working on that early stance shift. Once you get that down pat, and if they still have that particular restriction present, limitation in extension, adduction, IR on the left, limited flexion, abduction, ER on the right, you can actually skip mid-stance and go to late, because the motions that should be happening at the sacrum will be the same, and same thing with the femur. If I can get into late stance, then that means that I have been able to place my body, my femurs in particular, into extension, adduction, IR, and flexion, abduction, ER. So that's actually your terminal progression, and you won't have to do much of the frontal plane shifting. A move that I like would be a classic posterior hip stretch, where the left leg is back, the right leg is in front. You're rotating the sacrum to the left, getting a big stretch in the back of the hip. So if you see someone with a loss of left extension, adduction, IR, and a loss of right flexion, abduction, ER, you're going to start working early stance. Once you see some progression in motion, you're then going to work late stance with those people. The one thing that we're missing is mid-stance based activities, aka working on this frontal plane shifting action. So think lateral squats, lateral lunges, or one of my favorite moves, the table side stride. Anything where you're creating an oblique angle of the pelvis, where the left innominate would be higher than the right, because we're using the left leg as our reference point. In this particular situation, I am going to be in more hip extension when I'm in mid-stance. And I might be able to have some adduction and IR, but I typically won't have enough. This is when I'm thinking I need to work on this. If I see someone on the left-hand side, the left leg, if they have a limitation in hip flexion and they can't fully internally rotate, frontal plane shifting seems to be money. And I think the reason why that is because if I need mid-stance, well, and I have early stance, well, I'm probably getting some degree of hip extension in this situation. But what I might not be able to do is I might not be able to drop the hip down into adduction and internal rotation. But consider this, if I'm approaching mid-stance and I do have some femoral extension on the left, I actually might have a limitation in hip flexion on that side, because I'm moving towards extension of the hip. If you see left flexion and internal rotation limited, you probably need to do some type of frontal plane shifting. Moves I like. Table side stride is an awesome move. That's where you have your left foot on a book and you're creating this oblique angle of the pelvis, pushing yourself into the left leg. Anything that drives pure frontal plane adduction combined with internal rotation is absolute money to restore this phase of gait. And a lot of times I'll even see a loss of IR on the swing leg be restored by working in this position as well. And I think this goes back to what Bill Hartman has so eloquently put together, is when I'm in that mid stance, there's going to be internal rotation happening throughout the pelvis. So even if you're doing something like with that table side stride, where I'm doing more of an abduction, external rotation based activity, the pelvis in total is still relatively IR'd, and it seems to be useful in that regard. So if you see someone with a loss of hip flexion on the stance leg, which would be left, you probably want to work on some frontal plane shifting based activities. To summarize your amazing question and core, if you have a loss of hip extension on the left and a loss of hip flexion on the right, you're probably going to be spending time working early and late stance. Start with early. If you see some progression in motion but it's not full, then you want to progress to late. If you see someone where they have a loss of IR on the stance leg, and maybe they have a loss of hip flexion as well, that's when I think frontal plane shifting is very useful. And those are really your big tactics, is you have a rotational shift for early and late, you have a frontal plane shift for mid stance, and if you mess with those moves, you're probably going to be moving and grooving and mastering the gait cycle like a legend. Camilla. She's got a long question. Camilla's my homegirl, so I'm definitely going to answer it. I have a client, narrow ISA, who lacks hip IR and pronation. She waddles while she walks. We have been working together on addressing the stack and other layers. However, still big issues with hip extension and IR, and the feet are very stiff during gait. What strategies would you use? So this is a really good question, Camilla. The person who's got the waddling kind of gait, what they're trying to do is they're trying to find a way to work through mid-stance. This is a mid-stance deficit. So as I had talked about before, if I just look at mid-stance only, I'm not looking at early or late, what you should be seeing is this alternating oblique shifting or frontal plane shifting of the pelvis. Adduction and internal rotation should happen at this stage in the game. If your supreme clientele that you're working with, Camilla, can't do that, they're going to attempt to do that by waddling their bodies. So that could be them moving their trunk side to side. That could be them having a circumduction gait where they're whipping the leg around. That could be them actually trying to, if they're standing on their left leg, abducting way far over to try and create that shift, because I need this frontal plane action at that phase of gait. This is especially true if you catch someone who can't pronate the foot. And we didn't talk about this, but the same mechanics ought to happen at the foot. We'll use the right foot as our marker. At early stance, you're going to have more calcaneal inversion and supination. At mid stance, which is associated with ER, at mid stance, you're going to have pronation of the foot. So that's when your arch should flatten. Boom, like that. And then at late stance, you have a resupination and calcaneal inversion of the foot, but there's big toe extension. And that's really the big difference. Now, if I pair that with what's going on at the pelvis, we'll use right stance, which I know is going to be super duper confusing now since we've been talking left. But I'm going to use early right stance. So I have supination and femoral ER. Okay, now here's where your person is struggle bus. They start rotating the sacrum towards the right. And ideally what should happen is when I hit mid-stance, the foot should pronate. And I should see adduction and internal rotation at the pelvis, aka the right innominate is going to be higher than the left. But they can't do that. If they can't pronate the foot and they can't adduct and internally rotate the hip, and they can't create this frontal plane shift to the right, they're going to try some type of compensation. And so what they may do is, if they can't push everything down by internally rotating everything, they're going to fall over to the side on that right. So you'll see them really swing their trunk to the right when they're in right mid stance, as opposed to compressing everything down into internal rotation. So your fix, Camilla, for that person is to work on activities that involve this frontal plane shifting that I'm talking about. So that could be the table side stride, that could be a side lying stride activity, anything like that that could help you work on that range of motion. Basically, if they can't adduct and internally rotate, and we know that's needed for mid-stance, you need to choose things that work on adduction and internal rotation and pronation. And if you do that, you'll be representing the mid-stance nation. I think that's a good stopping point for us on today's debrief. I want to thank you so much for the amazing questions and comments on IG. Y'all have been amazing. Folks, I just want to give you a heads up. If you want to learn more, and hopefully if the world continues to heal, although I know it's a really tough time right now, so I hope that you're staying healthy during these wild times. But folks, Human Matrix is scheduled for next year. If you want to learn how to coach some of the stuff that I talked about in person, because you're like, man, yeah, I do struggle with the waddling gait, and I want to know how to unwaddleify my peeps. I can't stack, but yet I do want to talk to Zach, potentially in person. You can do that by Human Matrix. I am going to do everything in my power to make sure it is a safe environment for you folks during these wild and crazy COVID times. But I want to let you know the first one is coming up in Atlanta, Georgia, where the players play on February 20th and 21st. April 10th and 11th, we got Warren, Ohio. May 29th and 30th, Boston, Massachusetts. August 14th and 15th, Ann Arbor, Michigan. September 25th and 26th, Wyckoff, New Jersey, which is outside of the New York City. November 7th or 6th and 7th in Charlotte, North Carolina. Please sign up if you are feeling frisky. I think it'll be some good stuff. I've reworked the manual again. I got some new thoughts brewing. I'm excited. I'm hoping that things perk up with this whole COVID thing and we can make it happen. But put it on your calendars. Other places you can learn from your boy Big Z, especially if you want to sign up for that seminar. Go to zachcouples.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter because you're going to get so much free stuff, it's disgusting. You'll get access to my free course, Human Matrix Foundations, which goes over some of the relevant anatomy and biomechanics you need to get the most out of the debriefs and all the other content that I have. You'll get the Common Compensations Workbook. Would you like to make coaching easier? Because you see all these compensations, you're like, I don't know what to do. Well, what if I broke it down to 2 strategies for you? That's what that workbook does, and you'll only get it if you subscribe to my newsletter. You'll also get 5 hours of talks about breathing and pain, a free acute to chronic workload calculator, all types of good-ish. Definitely check it out. There's also a lot of services on zachcouples.com. If you're like, man, this Phase of Gait stuff sounds pretty cool, and I want to improve on some of my limitations by using this type of movement strategy. A movement consultation with your boy can be very helpful in that regard because I can take you through a full body assessment, address any movement restrictions you have by coaching you through some moves, get your movement and groovement to the next level. And folks, if you want to take that up a notch, you want to move well, but you also want to get gains or losses, depending on what your fitness goals are, I can help you through online training. This is especially helpful if you're someone who, you've kind of been working through this stuff, you're feeling better, but you want to keep it going. Online training with your boy is where it's at because we can take that movement consultation and I'll design a fitness program specific to your needs while respecting your movement goals. And the nice thing is I coach you throughout, so you can send me videos, I'll give you some feedback, the angels will sing, the birds will chirp, and your gains will be where they need to be. If you want to learn how to do this stuff with your supreme clientele, that's where the mentorship program is a great choice because I will challenge you to coach people to do some of this stuff. You send me videos, I give you feedback. We work through any didactic limitations you may have so you can really apply this stuff and get the results you so desire. And folks, if you're tuning in on IG Live, listen to what my homegirl Camilla has to say. For everyone who's never attended, Human Matrix is amazing. I know you did what I do, Camilla, when you said it. Zach doesn't pay me to say this. I do not. This is very true. She's not a plant. So please check me out there. If you've scoured zachcouples.com, you've read every blog that I've ever written, ever. You've checked out the show notes from this one, and you're like, man, I want to learn more. Check me out on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher by searching The Zach Couples Show. Because guess what, folks? There are 140 other debriefs out there. And, I've been kind of leaning out a little bit lately, and there was a time period where your boy was a little bit on the chub, as I called him, Fat Zach. You might not want to see me for those, and you might just want to listen to my sultry voice. So please check me out on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Search the Zach Couple Show. While you're there, please leave a review so the fam can keep growing. Last place you can find your boy is on the social medias. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, Z Couples. Of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And the last place you can find me is good old YouTube. Search Zach Couples. I just put out a few new activities that I've been applying with my supreme clientele. If you want to check out cool exercises, indications of when to do what, YouTube is the place to do it. Thank you so much for tuning in. You've been a beautiful, sexy, outstanding audience. And I hope that you stay safe during these wild times and keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving. And I'll see you next time. Deuces.